You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 24th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The US-UK trade deal, will it ever happen and does it matter if it doesn't? Is Jordan shuffling quietly to the centre of the world stage? And the overdue backlash gathers against public transport phone pests. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Rachel Cunliffe and Layla Milana Allen will discuss today's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Norway. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Rachel Cunliffe, Senior Associate Editor of The New Statesman, and Layla Milana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Rachel, you don't necessarily have the haunted expression which would confirm it, but you have recently been spending time with Reform UK, which I suspect may be best described to overseas listeners as the UK equivalent of MAGA.
In some ways, yes, but in some ways, what Nigel Farage, I think, is trying to do with Reform UK is be a little bit MAGA to pick up the MAGA disillusioned Conservatives, but also increasingly to pick up disillusioned Labour voters, particularly in places that Labour would have considered its traditional heartlands. So today is 1 week out from the local elections, which I'm sure is top of everyone's mind at the moment in the way that UK local elections always are. I'm a local election nerd. I love a good local election. But I've been looking at what the reform strategy is and how Nigel Farage is trying to combine those two really very different pools of voters in a way that is cohesive enough to get him some big wins next Thursday, or at the very least show that the polls that we've been seeing since the start of the year that put Reform above the Conservatives and equal to or above Labour might actually play out in real vote terms as well.
And people can read all about this where and when?
They could read it in this week's New Statesman magazine or online. And I've also got a feature specifically focusing on the race to be the next, or actually the first, 'cause it's a new mayoralty, the first mayor of Greater Lincolnshire. And the front runner there is Andrea Jenkins, former Conservative minister, now running for Reform. So that's a really interesting one to watch.
And Layla, you unusually have been in London for quite a protracted stretch. Are you enjoying it?
I really am enjoying it. I think one of the things that you forget when you are out in what we call the region, which as a foreign correspondent means wherever it is that you work, and that is for me mostly the Middle East and Africa, you know, sort of every day, everything that you do and everyone you know works on the same things that you do or is living the issues that you work on. And so it's interesting and eye-opening to kind of spend time. You know, I was just sitting there listening to Rachel talking about British politics. I used to be a British politics journalist 12 years ago, and I sort of emotionally separate myself as much from it as I can now because there's so much political strife everywhere I work. And so it's sort of nice sometimes to, you know, re-engage a little bit and re-engage in all the things that are happening back home.
Well, we will start by considering the recent reinvigoration of a mirage that has shimmered in the mid-Atlantic the entirety of this post-Brexit near decade, a US-UK trade deal. The notion has been generally correctly dismissed as a fever dream of Brexit ultras who believe that it would be preferable to trade with an entity, i.e. the United States, further away and with fewer people in it than the European Union. But it has recently been revived due to, one, the fact that the UK appears one of the few European countries to which the current US administration is not actively hostile, at least they haven't threatened to annex Shetland, and two, the desperation of the current British government to avoid having to choose between the US and Europe. Rachel, first of all, a question to which you can say pretty much anything, because really, if there ever is going to be an answer to it, it won't be soon and no one's going to remember what you said or hold you to it. Is this ever going to happen?
A UK-US trade deal? Oh, I have such deja vu with this question because I was asked this question so many times in the Theresa May Brexit era and then the Boris Johnson Brexit era, and then it all went away for a bit and it came back, and chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef were the key sticking points, and now we hear that hormone-injected beef is back on the agenda. Haven't heard much about chlorinated chicken. Sounds tasty. But the fundamental point of a US-UK trade deal is that the sticking points to it are not really who's in the White House or who's in Downing Street. They're pretty fundamental disagreements about what level of US agricultural food standard ideology is the UK prepared to accept. And that's not a Labour position or a Conservative position. That's just a British position, and that's always been a sticking point, and it looks like that will still be a sticking point. You know, Theresa May tried it, Liz Truss tried it when she was Trade Secretary.
Can't imagine where she found the time.
Didn't manage it. Kemi Badenoch tried and failed. Now she's Tory party leader. This just seems to be one of those things that just haunts whoever is in office. So, you know, good luck to them.
I mean, leaving aside those fundamentals, Layla, is attempting to negotiate literally anything with the current US administration going to be something of a fool's errand? We have seen, and it's not even 100 days that the Trump second administration has been in office, and we have seen at least that many times, however many days it is, that he is capable of believing 6 impossible things before breakfast.
That's absolutely true, but it is possible that there have been so many issues, fallout from these tariffs that have been imposed. And, you know, we've seen him pull back on a few things. For instance, smartphones. He realised that was going to be a major issue and he pulled back on some of those tariffs, etc. We're obviously seeing the luxury market start to collapse as Chinese manufacturers realise what they can do to overcome these tariffs and sell their goods. It is possible that in these trade talks, actually, this is a positive for the UK because they were given the lowest possible tariff, based on the current system. And maybe Trump will decide that actually this is one of the best negotiating partners. But the problem, as Rachel said, is there are pretty fundamental emotional triggers here, right? So it's not just food, which obviously, you know, for instance, hormones injected into beef. That's one of the major issues, which of course the UK wants to protect British farmers as well, especially after Brexit. So they don't want US manufactured beef flooding the market. But it's also an issue with driving. You know, the US wants to flood the UK with SUVs, but those SUVs have been built to protect the drivers, not protect pedestrians, and the UK is not willing to let down those barriers. The same with online protections for children, right? With social media and things like that. The US wants those brought down because they have a different attitude to how much protection should be offered to consumers online, and the UK has a very firm stance on that. The Online Safety Act, you know, Rachel Reeves made very clear they're not going to move away from that. So this is actually a cultural battle more than anything else. And the other issue, of course, is, you know, and one of the great things about not being a UK political journalist, unlike my other work, is that I can offer an opinion on this. And I am somebody for whom Brexit was a fundamental fissure in my understanding and belief of what it was to be a British person and what I felt our place in the world was. And many people of my generation, particularly those living in cities, would say we're going to spend decades trying to get back to the EU. Now, this is a pretty fundamental position where somebody that we thought would be a major partner, the US, has suddenly come out swinging and said we are fully isolationist. So this is actually an opportunity. We're seeing it with Ukraine deals. We're seeing it with defence, you know, potentially moving back towards the EU trade-wise too. We've got this other UK-EU conference coming up, and it's possible that actually this could be a positive in terms of realising that the EU are more our natural partners, particularly under this US leadership.
But is this the bind that Sir Keir Starmer finds himself in, and he has to think of a way to spend probably at least the next 4 years trying not to pick a side? Because obviously, for the reasons that Layla was adumbrating there, the United States has sort of wavered in its enthusiasm for Europe, while Starmer is very, very keen to keep that transatlantic special relationship, as Britain prefers to think of it, alive. But, you know, Starmer understands that economically, diplomatically, militarily, the relationship with Europe is obviously the future.
I think what Starmer is trying to do is be a bridge, that's the term that government likes to use, between Europe and the US. The question that immediately poses is a bridge to what? You know, how can you build a bridge if one side of the bridge isn't really interested in the idea of bridges unless they own them and can use them for their own advantage? And trying to get the best of both worlds, which is, again, what the UK government initially thought that they were able to do when Britain got a lower tariff rate than most countries in Europe, does run the risk of leaving you isolated from both if the EU moves in a different direction as a bloc, and where is the UK in that? There's also the question of, OK, you're trying to negotiate a trade deal with the US. Do you trust that the US priorities or the agenda will be the same in a couple of years, a couple of months, a couple of days? We've seen how quickly Trump can change his mind on things. So the US has proved that they're not the most reliable trade partner either. And so there is a worry, and I've heard this from Labour MPs, that if you offer something, whether it is concessions on the digital services tax or concessions on tariffs on US cars, how do you know that they won't come back and decide that they want something else or change their mind? Or, somebody will, a Scottish pigeon will look at Trump funny, or he'll get upset about being booed if he comes here for a state visit, and, suddenly all bets are off. And there are crunch points coming with all of this. I mean, one of the things that the UK is desperate to get with the EU is an agreement on veterinary medicine and services there. And that could really be thrown into question by making concessions on the agricultural front with the US. So it's not really clear how long the UK government can ride both horses at once, as it were. I'm mixing metaphors terribly. Can you ride horses over a bridge?
It's been done. It's been done. But we will go now to Jordan, which through decades of care, guile and cunning has become that Middle Eastern country which rarely features in the deliberations of prestigious current affairs forums such as this, the Monocle Daily. As the merest glance at Jordan's immediate neighbourhood confirms, this is no small triumph of statecraft. While all around it are perennially roiled by war, revolution, terror and riot, Jordan, give or take the occasional brouhaha of the sort which could happen pretty much anywhere, causes and endures little trouble. It does, however, appear to be growing keener on playing a greater diplomatic role. Layla, interesting domestic development this week, and by interesting I mean by way of illustrating my earlier point. You read about Jordan so rarely that you forget to read about Jordan, and this week it has officially pulled the plug on the local chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I have to confess I vaguely assumed this was something they'd done about 20 years ago. Is it weird that they hadn't?
So look, the way Jordan works is, and this is sort of, what's widely known amongst those of us who live and work out there, it's a benign dictatorship. It's not a full democracy. The reality is it sort of holds, half of the sort of allowance of some level of democracy, while also on the other side playing the Gulf game of essentially behave yourselves and you will get lots of carrots, but don't behave yourselves and you'll get lots of sticks. That's how the Jordanian monarchy has kept control for a very long time. And their number one priority is security. They are in a very difficult position. In fact, more than half the population is Palestinian of Jordan. Now, some of those have citizenship, some don't, but particularly the younger generation, a lot identify as Palestinian as well as Jordanian because of the political issues. Now, in the 70s, we saw an uprising in Jordan where they very nearly won, and that country would have become whatever kind of Palestine they wanted it to be. And it was actually only put down with support of Britain and the US, who wanted to keep that stronghold there. So King Abdullah is constantly aware of this. Now, thus far, the Muslim Brotherhood has been allowed to sort of trickle along. But essentially what's happened is that on April 15th, 16 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were arrested for supposedly a terror plot, which apparently had been going on for years. And they were supposedly building rockets, stockpiling drones, etc. And they've now used this as a security reason. They've said, we're shutting you down completely. The big question here is how this translates politically, because the Islamic Action Front, which is the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, is won the most seats in the parliamentary election last September. Now, the question is how King Abdullah will translate this. Is he going to say that also means the IF is off the board because then you are very obviously, rather than subtly, stepping on democracy? Or is he going to try and separate them out and say, we want you to prove that you are purely political and that you're not linked to this part of the Brotherhood? Then, of course, there's all the security issues linked to the huge problems that what's going on in Israel and Palestine is causing right now for Jordan. Their concerns about, public opinion, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is an offshoot and supported by more radical elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, what their young population is going to think about this and how they're going to feel, and also the question of, as you said, they're very, very involved in diplomacy. whatever kind of deal does eventually happen, Jordan is going to be a major player in that. So they need to make sure that they are very politically stable so that elements of parliament, for instance, aren't fighting so hard for a deal that's favourable to Hamas that they would, for instance, be asked to host Hamas leaders who've had to leave the West Bank, which is something they would absolutely refuse because of the level of instability it would cause. They do not want terror coming onto their land by any means.
I just want to follow something up quickly there before we take a broader look, Layla. The Muslim Brotherhood, though, across the wider region, are they still quite the big deal they have been over the last few decades, or did they sort of peak with getting Mohamed Morsi briefly into the president's office in Egypt?
So there's been a huge sort of crash in their at least publicly visible influence since the failure of the project in Egypt. And also importantly, after that, many other governments also cracked down on the Brotherhood. Now, what's important here is that essentially the Muslim Brotherhood came from the advent of political Islam and political jihad in Islam. And for anybody who's interested in that, there's an incredible book called The Looming Tower, which was written about the build-up to 9/11, but the first half of it is all about how political jihad and political Islam was built in the 1940s and 50s, and it all came from one of the original founders of the Brotherhood. So that's why everyone's so worried about them. They are grassroots, and they do recruit a lot of very intelligent, concerned young people who want to see a different kind of sort of political Islam, essentially, in the region. So they don't have the power they used to have, but they do have very, very good recruiting on the ground. And there are elements of the Brotherhood that do always lean towards jihad. And jihad is not necessarily violent, but sometimes that leads to violence too. So they're sort of always bubbling there, but they have been so heavily stamped upon that this doesn't actually make that much of a difference in terms of their wider networks.
Rachel, on the subject of the diplomacy, and this is more of a general rather than a specific question, because we have seen King Abdullah II of Jordan in Jeddah this week, visiting Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Crown Prince and real power behind the throne. But it's this idea of, I guess, the incongruity or otherwise of monarchies conducting diplomacy at this juncture in the 21st century, because there has been a case made for the Middle Eastern monarchies that they do at least provide an amount of stability. They all survived the Arab Spring, give or take one or two wobbles. The republics tended not to. Is there something to be said for it? Not that I'm suggesting we should be encouraging King Charles in that direction.
I think there's something to be said for monarchy as a stabilising force alongside democracy. I mean, that's kind of what we've got here. We've got a monarch that stabilises our democracy. I'm a big believer in the British royal family and its role in enabling our democracy to really progress in the way that it has, even though I would never in a million years want anything to do with that lifestyle. I think in the Middle East, though, what you've got is a number of examples of different forms of government, none of which are the ideal of, if you wrote down on paper what an idealised democracy would look like. And the monarchies seem to be the more stable of the options available. I think it's really interesting looking at how Saudi Arabia and Jordan are kind of becoming or have been traditionally, the brokers in trying to negotiate something resembling an end to the war in Gaza, as the US has really stepped away from it. I mean, we had Donald Trump saying that he would come in and sort the war out on day one. Then we had the idea of Gaza Riviera, that the US would take over, but there wouldn't be any boots on the ground. And then once it became obvious that really Gaza in the Middle East is a little bit more complicated than that, lost interest completely. And it has been up to the other Middle Eastern countries, the monarchies in particular, to kind of go, well, somebody's got to take some kind of leadership here. Can we help fulfill that role?
And that is really, really vital, actually, just because this is what Arab nations have wanted for decades, right? They want Arab nations to be sorting out their problems because they actually understand, they feel that they actually care in a way that Western nations don't, right? Western nations just want things to be peaceful because it helps them financially or whatever else, unless it's their war. So actually having places like Jordan...
They've got a stake in it.
They've got a stake in it. They've got an emotional stake in it. And what's really different from our royal family is that, for instance, in in Jordan, King Abdullah, is very politically active. He takes a stand. He's the one who went to see Trump. He's an incredibly shrewd negotiator. He's an incredibly charming man. He understands politics, but he's also very emotionally involved. His wife, Queen Rania, she is Palestinian. Whatever else might be said from it, is deeply clear that they care very, very much about people. They care, they host so many Palestinian refugees, so many Syrian refugees in this tiny country, right? And I think a lot of people in the region feel that the Jordanian royal family care emotionally, apart from anything else being so small and being in the Levant in a way that the Gulf countries aren't, when perhaps Gulf countries, while powerful, are slightly more just interested in the financial side. So there is real investment in them as political leaders in the region, and they actually want Abdullah to step forward and do a bit more.
Well, to what appears a minor but salutary blow struck against the remorseless advance of AI, perhaps poised to become the most definitive proof to date that humanity as a species will happily embrace things getting worse as long as it makes them easier. An agglomeration of UK licensing bodies has announced what they are calling a pioneering collective licence, which will enable authors to get paid for the use of their works in training the generative AI models now being used by students everywhere to write their essays and teachers everywhere to mark them. Rachel, are we enthused by this? Would we be into our works, by which I mean yours, getting used to train these things if you were seeing a few quid out the other side of it?
Well, I've never written a book and I have no intention to write a book because
You've written plenty of magazine articles and I bet they're all over those.
Everything about AI and the AI books rewriting saga just fills me with despair. Partly because it's so bad, partly because it's really bad for authors and artists, partly because I think this is the key thing, it takes all the joy out of creativity. I am all for AI when it comes to diagnosing conditions or being used in civic planning or things like that. I'd actually be for AI if we could find ways to automate some of the jobs that people don't want to do to enable humans to be more fulfilled and creative. It does seem like the jobs that AI is coming after are the ones that we'd all quite like to do, like authors and artists. And I think something's gone very badly wrong there. Maybe I'm cynical. I worry that it's kind of the cat's out of the bag on this, that the damage has already been done. I would welcome any attempt to try and enable authors to be fairly paid for work that has been used without their permission and, let's face it, abused by these companies. I found it very telling that Meta's excuse for not paying authors for the work that it used to train their AI models on was it's too difficult and expensive. If it's too difficult and expensive, don't do it. And yet they did.
Or my response would be, tell somebody who cares. I mean, that's your problem to fix if it's difficult and expensive. Layla, how enthused are you about this? Because I have to say that the whole thing does fill me with a certain amount of horror. I have fiddled a bit with things such as ChatGPT and have been both terrified yet reassured by when you ask it for, a certain passage on something you actually know about. It's riddled with absolutely honking factual errors. And I have once or twice tried the narcissistic, admittedly, experiment of asking it to write 500 words on this given subject in the style of me. And what it's come back with is, well, one, I could be insulted by it, but also I tend to think, actually, I'm quite confident I'm still making a living because this is drivel.
Well, I think for so many of us, like the three of us sitting at this table who are, gag, that terrible word, creators, this is a deeply emotional and visceral issue, right? And for me in particular, who, I'm not just a writer and reporter. My entire life is about being there. I am an on-the-ground field reporter, right? I don't write things from a desk. So the concept that anything could recreate that is, to me, absolute nonsense, because I constantly have the bit between my teeth of really bringing people what is actually happening on the front line. But I had a really interesting experience the other day where, and I think many of us have just rejected AI completely. I don't want anything to do with it. But of course, that's the wrong approach because actually then we get left behind. I was on a trip in Vienna with friends and one of them went, let's get ChatGPT to write us a guide. And we sat there and in, 3 minutes, we said we want something by the river and we want somewhere we can have oysters and nice wine and, see a few of these places and go through this exhibition, etc. The most incredible guide. And my friend and I immediately went, who's another journalist, went, oh, actually, it can do positive things and that's wonderful, how amazing. And then I went, oh, yes, but what if I were somebody who's a travel writer and my entire job is to have these experiences? So I think that's part of the problem, is that everybody wants it for the thing that isn't taking away from what they do. However, I was thinking the other day about the mistakes that were made, why journalism is so badly defunded. Somebody was asking me this at a talk, and I said, back in the day when things went online, if we had initially charged for everything, TV online, print online, everything, people would not only have been happy to pay because they'd always paid, they would have paid more because it was more convenient than going to the shop and buying a newspaper. But we never did that. So rather than the horse is already bolted, which I suppose it has slightly, anything we can do to try and make the inevitability that they are going to be using everything we write and create to train ChatGPT, to train AI, to actually make sure that the creators are being paid for it. I think anything we can try and do as early as possible can only be welcome to try and not make those mistakes again.
The thing that really worries me, though, is reading the report on this idea for a license that's kind of negotiated on behalf of all authors rather than having to do it individually. Is there was the question of, okay, well, how much could an author expect to be paid? And there was no answer on that. And I think until you have an answer on that, I'm just going to be really sceptical about these
Speaking
efforts.
as an author, Rachel, I'm completely confident that it's going to be an absolutely vast amount of money. It's going to make us all rich beyond our wildest imaginings. Listeners may detect a note of leaden sarcasm. Here in the United Kingdom, meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats have guaranteed themselves a landslide victory at the next general election by pitching a ban on the playing of audible audio from phones on public transport. There are problems with the Lib Dems' proposal. In characteristically woolly fashion, they are suggesting merely a £1,000 fine, rather than an enthusiastic application of tar and feathers and a heaving into the nearest available canal by a righteously angry mob, but it is a start. At least one precedent has been established in Portugal, it turns out. Acting like this variety of antisocial jackass could see you relieved of €250. Rachel, I believe you have views.
I have personal experience on this. So earlier this week, last week, I was on the tube and a girl, 16, 17, and her friend, she was playing her really quite personal voice note out loud. And I said, excuse me, would you mind using headphones? And she looked at me like I'd grown an extra head and said, I don't have any. And I said, well, not everyone on this train wants to hear your personal voice note. And I got this shocked look back. She did, in fairness, turn off the voice message, and she was getting off 2 stops later, and as I was getting off too, and she turned to me and went, there's so much rudeness in the world, you don't have to add to it. And
Amazing.
I was so shocked at the idea that politely, and I was polite and I wasn't aggressive, and I did it because I felt fairly sure that she wasn't going to attack me, which I wouldn't necessarily do that in every circumstance. But the idea of politely saying to someone, this is a public space that you're in, and there are rules on TfL, but there are also just societal norms that we all kind of adhere to have a nice society. Just reminding them of that I'm the one that's rude. I had
That's
no
fantastic.
response whatsoever.
Absolutely amazing. Layla, are you a teller of people to put a sock in it in such circumstances?
I am absolutely not. I've always been somebody who's extremely good at standing up for other people and terrible at standing up for myself. So if I'm protecting somebody else, absolutely I'm all over it myself. I'll just take the inconvenience. But I do think this is generational as well. It was really interesting hearing you say that because, Rachel, I think we're probably around the same age. And, we're young, but we're not young. We're old young to the younger generation.
I'm proudly millennial.
Well, quite. But, as a result, like when you said that, it really conjured in me kind of, women who at the time I would have thought were old, who of course actually, in their mid-30s or whatever, extremely young. When I was a teenager who'd sort of make pissy comments and we'd think, oh God, she's so old and dried up and whatever else. When in fact they were just trying to have a nice quiet day. And I do think this is generational that, for us, for instance, when we were teenagers, we'd have a loud gossipy conversation on a train and somebody would look at us po-faced and say, could you keep it down? Not everyone wants to hear your conversation. But for us, we were having conversation. So for us, the idea of playing something out of a speaker is incredibly bizarre because you would never impose upon other people's lives like that. But if you've grown up with that phone in your hand from 5 years old and that's how you identify with the world, that's then culturally much less of an issue, right? Because you're just engaging with your phone in the way that you do and all your friends do.
I can't believe you're defending this.
I'm not, sorry, to be clear, I'm not defending it at all. I put it to you
that this is an explanation, not an excuse.
This is an explanation, not a defence. To be clear, I think it's terrible. I'm just saying that I think trying to engage with it in a way that actually teaches a dangerous word, tries to encourage a younger generation that the way that you respect people is by creating a space in which everyone is able to have their own privacy and, rather than attacking them or punishing them, is much more likely to create the atmosphere that we're looking for in this now very individualized world in which everyone lives in their own world with their phone and whatever else, rather than essentially creating, a new ASBO for people who are on their phones on the train.
Well, on that thought, the fun part here, obviously, Rachel, because as Layla points out, and I think you pointed out as well, this is by TfL's current bylaws already illegal. It's against their conditions of carriage. It's all written down there. The problem, like most aspects of TfL's conditions of carriage, and indeed almost all crime and anti-social behaviour in London, is that nobody enforces any of the rules that actually exist. Is that not actually the issue, and is that going to be where any such policy founders?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't think the idea of diverting valuable police and court resources to punish people for not having headphones is the best way, shall we say, to...
I do.
Well, maybe, but we've currently got a situation where court cases for really violent crimes are not being held until 2029. So there is an issue with enforcement, and if TfL are going to get serious about enforcement, they should probably start with fare dodging. I think I read early this week that more than 10% of people just don't pay for the tube. So there's a kind of wider question here, and I don't like blaming everything on COVID because I feel like that can become a very easy excuse, but I do think that COVID had a role in this, that we all didn't engage in society for a prolonged length of time, and lots of people, it seems, have forgotten how to do that. It's fare dodging, it's the headphones issue, it's the fact that people now, this idea that you would let people off the train before trying to push your way on, that's gone out the window. And I don't think you can necessarily fix that with fines and enforcement, although I personally believe that anyone who plays things on their phone without headphones should just be banned from ever owning a smartphone for the rest of their life. I think that's reasonable.
Well, that's also a better policy. And not to be an apologist again, but the only thing I would say there is that I think a lot of those people of that generation, yes, absolutely, COVID did that to a lot of us. But what it also did was many of those people did not have that period of teenagehood or early 20s when you learn those lessons about living in society, right? So it's not just that they've forgotten. They may never have had those experiences in the first place, which is why I think we're kind of talking about a bigger issue here where we need to be looking at how we live as a society and do things for each other rather than just punishing anything that we don't like.
I should say that the girl in my case was a teenager, but I put this on Blue Sky and I put her age down, and I got hundreds of comments from people saying that they feel that the worst offenders are actually people in their 60s, 70s and 80s who maybe never learnt how to use technology in a civic responsible way.
I genuinely don't think, from my own observation, that there's any particular demographic trend of any kind attached to this. It is often just... Yeah, I don't detect anything like that at all. It is just some people who either have forgotten or never learnt how to behave in public or to observe the golden rule of not merely being a passenger on public transport, but basically being a citizen, which is pretty much if anybody else notices anything you're doing, you're probably being a jerk.
Well, it's so bizarre to me. I can't understand that because I live in terror of accidentally pressing Instagram the wrong way so that the sound plays while I'm looking at something. So I can't imagine just deciding that everyone in the carriage wants to hear my voice message, but maybe she's got a thrilling life that she is entirely proud of and there was nothing shameful or embarrassing in that message at all.
Next time it happens, I'm going to offer advice on the relationship in question.
Well, I think we're all agreed these people should be fired out of cannons. Rachel Cunliffe and Layla Milana Allen, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is postmarked Norway.
After 8 years living in the UK, Japan, and various shorter-term stays around Europe and Asia in between, my bags are packed and ready to head home to Norway. In that spirit, consider this less of a letter from and more of a prodigal letter to my home country. Besides joining Monocle's cadre of Scandi contributors, I'm excited to reconnect with that cosy, happy-to-stay-at-home attitude Norwegians pride themselves on, and which seems to come hand in hand with janteloven, or the law of jante. This was satirically coined by a Danish-Norwegian author in the 1930s, but has since been adopted as a solid description of Scandi social norms. Among other things, it promotes community values and disapproves of individualistic competition or expressing strong opinions that deviate from accepted boundaries. It's also probably part of why Norwegians are such content and happy people. Here in the UK, whether you're a born and raised local or a foreigner, there's a tendency for conversations to veer into complaining territory. We complain about how other countries get more sun, have less insane politicians, are more affordable, safer, grittier, or more exciting, like a constant sense of FOMO. Compare that to the comments I hear whenever I go home. We have it pretty good here in Norway, don't we? Things could be worse, couldn't they? Or to quote one of Norway's most cliché phrases, borte bra, hjemme best, which basically translates to, away is good, but home is best. Indeed, if you so much as think of complaining about the state of things in Norway, you're at risk of someone's mother telling you to think of the poor children in Sweden. I'm just kidding, Sweden. You know we love you. I think more than anything, the happiness of Norwegians come from a belief that most of life's hardships can be solved through some mix of community, decently competent government, going skiing, or hiking up to the nearest mountain with a backpack full of coffee and biscuits. That attitude has served us well and consistently placed us at or near the top of the World Happiness Report. However, happy as we are, it is not an excuse to rest on our laurels. Many hold the naive belief that they will always be rich, prosperous and safe, that Norway has somehow reached a societal end of history that cannot be subverted. But Norway's sense of financial stability is on fragile ground. Today, housing prices are ballooning as building regulation and NIMBYism thrive. Innovative startups are forced to go abroad if they want a chance to seriously grow, and the mainland economy has nearly flatlined. The country's main financial hedge, our nearly €2 trillion oil fund, is spent mostly on inflated government services rather than making us more dynamic or giving a boost to our educational institutions, which by many measures are also in decline. From a security perspective, Norway has failed to respond adequately to the Russian threat, being stingy with its aid to Ukraine despite making 5 to 6 times more revenues from oil and gas as a direct result of the invasion. These are all realities that the bulwark of Norwegian society have been slow to acknowledge, until recently. As I've readied myself for the journey home, I'm delighted to say that the tone is changing. This year, Norway's aid commitments to Ukraine have more than doubled, putting us on par or even surpassing our Scandinavian cousins. Our favourite former Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, who did wonders to grow our economy, manage our oil wealth, and who was dubbed the Trump Whisperer for how well he handled the US president during his tenure as head of NATO, has also returned to Norway as our new finance minister. As we speak, Stoltenberg is about to sit down with Trump in the White House alongside our Prime Minister to hash out a tariff deal and discuss the war in Ukraine. Besides his mission in the US, Stoltenberg has already taken steps to stimulate economic growth at home and has almost single-handedly turned around people's confidence in the future of Norwegian politics. Things are changing, and I'm starting to see that Norwegians are no longer just comfortable living in Norway, they are excited to be living there. There's optimism, even as the world begins to feel more and more uncertain. Whether it's the oil wealth giving us a financial safety net, a history of relatively competent government, or our world-class welfare system, Norwegians are right to believe they are among the luckiest people on earth. Being lucky should be an invitation to make the most of what you have, to reinvent yourself, go against the grain, and stay on your toes. These are qualities that might make any stringent follower of janteloven a little squeamish, but they're also the qualities that paradoxically made Norway such a special comfort zone in the first place. For Monocle Radio, I'm Gunnar Granlid.
Thank you, Gunnar. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Rachel Cunliffe and Leila Milana Allen. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Francesca Jokes. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.